Hi, welcome to Who is Essential? Race, Culture, and Identity in American Democracy. This is a part of our virtual International Festival of Arts and Ideas. My name is Elizabeth Nearing. I'm the curator of Ideas Programming, and with me I have a special guest. This is Jeanette. Welcome. The International Festival of Arts and Ideas is created and produced on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac in the land we call home, Connecticut. For more information about native land near you, you can go to native-land.ca. I'll put the link in the comments so you can check out wherever you are. And the International Festival of Arts and Ideas stands with Black Lives Matter and with countless citizens in our own city and across the country who are exercising their right to protest the systemic racism at the root of police violence. The festival stands in solidarity with Black and Brown communities who are targeted and abused by unjust systems of oppression. And this year, our Ideas programming is all about democracy, we the people. We've been creating it with partners and collaborators, and in particular, the Connecticut Mirror has been an amazing partner in all of this. And Jeanette, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about what the Mirror does in Connecticut.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Again, my name is Jeanette DeJesus, and I'm proud to be the chair of the board of the Connecticut Mirror. And the CT Mirror is a 10-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan, online-only news organization that covers public policy and government in Connecticut. A critical part of our mission is to amplify and encourage dialogue among people with diverse perspectives. And that's why we're really proud to support this evening's discussion that asks and explores the very important and provocative question, who is essential? And after this evening, this conversation is over, we welcome you to read the CT Mirror's ongoing coverage of housing and education, health, justice, and economic disparities and emerging solutions to those disparities. Again, I'm really proud to be here and the part of the CT Mirror and welcome you. Bienvenidos a todos.
Gracias, Jeanette. Thank you. We have other partners who've helped us along the way, including Connecticut Humanities, the Whitney Center, and support from CT Public. And throughout the event, we'll be using the comment feature and encourage you to do the same. So we'll put up Mirror articles that are related to what folks are talking about, websites, resources that get mentioned, and hope that you include your comments and your questions as we go along so we can incorporate them in the conversation, like we're in the same virtual room. Without any further ado, I would love to introduce you to our phenomenal team for this evening's event. We have the host of Connecticut Mirror's podcast, Steady Habits, John Dankosky, and professor of political science at Quinnipiac University and the author of Identity Politics in the United States, Dr. Khalilah Brown-Dean. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, and thanks, Jeanette. It's good to be back. This is the third of these conversations that I've taken part in with the festival, and I'm so glad that the festival is happening in this virtual way, in this unusual world where we're all meeting like this an awful lot more than we ever have. It's great to be in a virtual space with you tonight, and it's especially great to see you, my friend. Khalilah Brown-Dean and I have been working together on the radio for many years, and it's the first time we get to share a stage, as it were, at the festival. So a very good evening to you.
It's good to see you, my friend.
I want to start by thinking back to the time when we first came up with this idea for this conversation. You have a new book out. It's called Identity Politics in the United States. And we wanted to talk about identity politics and the role it was going to play in our American democracy, this big election coming up. And let's just say a lot of things have happened in America since we first had that conversation. I had a little list of things we could talk about. So there's the ongoing COVID crisis. There's the question of who is affected by COVID. Mm-hmm. There's the question of, should I wear a mask or not, or am I allowed to not wear a mask? Who's an essential worker? Of course, Black Lives Matter rallies across America and across the world, police reform, systemic racism, statues being torn down, including maybe in New Haven on the green there in Worcester Square. And of course, the Supreme Court decision just this week about LGBTQ workers' rights. All those things have something in common, don't they?
They do. And I keep thinking there's so much that we can talk about in this hour. But John, the timing of this. When we started this conversation, as you said, we were thinking about the election. We were thinking about the census. We were thinking about impeachment. Remember that? It seems so long ago. And when we were thinking about what is that common thread, it really is about identity and about battles over whose voices matter, whose experiences get included and are thought of in the way as when we think of American citizenship. But at that time, it was also about how do we resolve conflicts? What happens when what I want and my vision of this country is different from yours? And so even though we started that conversation back in February, here we are in June, and we're seeing that same debate play out in courtrooms, on street corners, in office boardrooms, and even now in people's homes in a way that we did not anticipate. But I'm glad we were prepared to have the conversation.
The idea of identity, especially identity in our political conversations, is something that has always been fraught.
Right.
And I think one of the reasons it's so fraught is that it's almost like identity is something that other people talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't want to talk necessarily about my identity, or maybe I don't even want you talking about your identity. It's clearly there, but it seems to be something up until recently that we've put aside. I mean, how do you think about that? How do you think about the idea of identity in politics?
The way that I think about it is, again, what we're seeing play out. Identity is for other people. And generally, it's for people who aren't like me, whose group experience isn't like mine. And it's about people who have some kind of grievance. And now I feel uncomfortable or I feel inconvenienced because you are raising these issues. And I think what we're seeing, John, is that we all have identities that matter politically. The very founding of this country was based on a battle over identity. Who are we separate from the British Crown? Who are we vis-a-vis the native people who were already here? And now we want to establish our presence. Identity politics is happening in cities across this country as they're debating whether to keep up a Columbus statue, right? Of people saying, get over your history, but allow me to hold on to my history and my identity so that I don't feel like my community and my experience, my American story is being erased. That is identity politics.
But so much of what we think about, though, in identity politics is focused on the identity politics of Black Americans, of Latino Americans, of immigrants to this country.
Right.
We don't really think about white identity. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, and I've really been thinking about it in the last couple hours since we talked. I think that there's something about white identity that white liberals don't want to even touch. We don't want to even own, because the idea of someone who believes in basically equality for everyone is that if I identify too closely with my white identity, then I'm identifying with something that is almost seen as a pejorative to other people who agree with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
White identity equals white supremacy. But in order for us to get over this, white people probably have to come to grips with who exactly they are and what their identity means to them a little bit more than we probably have.
And that is, a reckoning that has to happen that is not about white guilt. And I think that is what makes many people not want to have that conversation or not have that reflection. I don't want you to feel guilty about your identity. I am proud of mine. I claim my history, and that is what shapes who I am today. But what I want people to also think about when they think about their identity and their American story is, what are the commonalities that exist? What does it mean to be a person of Irish descent? And understand that in places like Boston and across Connecticut and across New York, public schools adopted the King James Bible because they did not want Irish Catholic children in their schools. So when the state says that you do not belong, you should not have access to public education, which is a civil right, full stop, then your identity and your American story is forged in opposition to that definition. So when we think about Irish immigrants during that time, we think about Italian immigrants, the fear that all these single Italian men were going to come and corrupt American women. When we think about that in the 1800s, and then we go to 2016 and hear comments about Mexican rapists coming to, terrorize our country, that common theme is something that people should take a step back and say, I don't have to feel guilty about my identity. I can now see where those identities overlap and what are the structural forces that make that so.
In your book, you talk about this, and we've talked about this for years. I mean, you're a historian, and there's almost always some sort of precedent that you can cite in American history that will tell us a little bit about this present time. And just as you're talking about it, I was thinking about the notion that America likes to tell about itself as a melting pot. The idea I grew up with as a melting pot is, isn't it great? People from all over the world can come here and we can all make this really great place. And we don't all have to be from exactly the same place, and we don't all have to look the same. But the more nefarious part of the melting pot that you explore in your book is that what we have systemically done is we've said, we want you to come here and we want you to be part of this, but we want you to give away all of the things that make you you, and all of the traditions and practices, maybe even the language that you grew up with. And that's a part of the melting pot story that I think we're coming to a reckoning with right now.
And the generational effects of that melting pot story are profound. When you have families who say, I don't want you to learn our native language, whatever your country of origin is, I don't want to teach my children that language because I don't want them to speak English with an accent and be discriminated against. So we hear that now from Spanish-speaking families who say, I don't want my children to learn Spanish. It's the same thing that we heard from Irish families and families coming from Germany. And so that melting pot metaphor, which was so popular, often undermines the very real structural ways that people were stripped of their heritage and then punished for holding on to anything that they thought of as being unique or as being a part of their own. That manifests into where certain groups could live. And that, again, has generational consequences from when we think about what is the community that we aspire to and what are the opportunities to pursue it.
What do you think is different about this particular moment when it comes to calls for racial justice, not just about racial justice in terms of the way in which Americans are policed, but in terms of the way we value people who look different than the majority white population? I mean, the fact that this has Columbus statues coming down and it has people marching for things beyond George Floyd's name and life seems to be something a little bit different. But do you sense that something is different about this time?
Let me give you two examples, John, of why I sense that something is different. You know this well because I talk about it often. I am a Virginia native. It is very much an important part of my identity to say that I was born and raised in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I grew up in a time where the state actively resisted having to recognize the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. And so the concession that the state made, because they didn't want to keep going through these legal challenges, was to celebrate Lee Jackson King Day. So for 15 years of my life, we had to honor Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Martin Luther King Jr. on the same day, right? Talk about an identity crisis.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. And then today, to hear the governor of the Commonwealth with all of his issues about race and racism and identity say maybe it's time for us as a state to honor and recognize Juneteenth. I never imagined that that would happen. And yet it's setting into motion for the Republican leader of the state to issue a statement saying, I too agree that if we are a nation that believes in freedom, we have to understand those moments that disrupted freedom. The second key example, John, and again, I know, you like to give me a hard time about this, as someone who grew up in NASCAR country, Never would I have imagined that NASCAR as an organization would say the Confederate flag is not compatible with the values that we want as an organization. And some people may say, look, does that really change anything? Does that make a material difference? I think we're seeing in a moment where there is substance in the symbolic. And that substance and that symbolism is making people take a step back and say, wait a minute, why are we just now coming to this realization? So if you were woke 10 years ago, or you just became woke yesterday, now what do we do so that this is not just a moment, but really a comprehensive movement to figure out what the country is that we want to have?
I think those is something that is important, especially as we have this conversation. And again, it's on the internet; it can be seen anywhere. But we're having this conversation with you in New Haven. I'm in Winstead. I'm in the northwest corner. But we're as a thought exercise, we're located in New Haven, Connecticut. We, by and large, although we may see around my house in Winstead, down the street, a Confederate flag now and again, it is seen in our part of the world largely as something that is not part of our culture. We don't accept it. Some people believe that that's what they have to fly off of their truck for some damned reason, but it's not something that we accept as a populace here in Connecticut by and large. The fact that NASCAR is getting rid of the Connecticut or the Confederate flag, the fact that it's going away from state houses, that may be one thing, but where you grew up in Virginia, it's not like people still don't believe that that's something that they should be able to fly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a different conversation here in New Haven than it is in Virginia, than it is in Tennessee, than it is in Alabama right now, isn't it?
I think region makes a big difference in terms of what is viewed as socially acceptable, but also the vigor with which people want to pursue change. You know, I say to people all the time who try to make fun of the South and say like, oh, this Southern thing. And I remind people that in many ways, my experience living in Connecticut and living in New England has actually been an up South experience. The difference from where I grew up is that people make it very clear where they stand. I knew where not to go as a child. I know that when we are traveling back home to Virginia, we know there are certain stretches of that trip where we do not stop. Right? We have planned out our own modern day green book because we understand that. But then it becomes, uncomfortable when I have to explain to my child why certain things happen in Connecticut that are rooted in the very same sense of exclusion that we experience more directly in the South, whether that is the composition of public schools across our state, whether that is housing patterns, whether that is the resistance to basic common sense efforts to keep people safe. All of that is rooted in this idea of power, of difference, and of holding on to those distinctions that have served many people very well for a long time.
You gave some examples of why you think this moment might be different. Why do you think this moment's different? Is it about the fact that we're in this pandemic that has disrupted so much else about life? Is it that the message finally somehow is getting through to people, that so many young people are involved and they're just not going to put up with us anymore? I mean, what do you think it is?
I think it is all of the above. And let me tell you why. One of the greatest joys of my life is being a college professor and getting to work with young people every single day, and of understanding the potential for growth that can come from conversations that other people take for granted or that others discard. So when you see young people on the streets of various cities, literally putting their bodies on the line for this movement, when you see a diverse group of young people linking arms and standing in front of a major department store and saying, no, you will not vandalize this because you don't have the right to take away from our movement, that's power. And that is a kind of hope that I think for many of us, we had lost sight of. We also can't underestimate how big of a deal it is that COVID-19 is this global pandemic that could have been prevented or contained has swept across this country the way that it is. So that now you have people who started 2020 thinking that they were in good standing. They had the right job, they had the right education, they had the home in the perfect zip code. And because of COVID, because everything shut down almost overnight, they realized that they were vulnerable in a way that others have been navigating throughout their life. It means something when people have lost their job and are trying to figure out how are they going to provide for their family? Where do they go for help? What are the resources? When you and I know that there are people who navigate that uncertainty every single day of getting to a low-wage job, using public transportation while trying to ensure that your children have adequate childcare, and fearing that you're going to have more days in the month than you do dollars in the bank. So that kind of reality, and the fact that most of us are home and can't disconnect from news and coverage the way we could normally, it created the conditions for an awareness that I think some people ignored in the past.
The idea that hundreds of thousands, millions of people, for the first time in their lives, had to go on and apply for unemployment benefits.
Yeah.
And to go through the process of applying on a state website each week to get these benefits, it becomes almost a full-time job, just figuring out how to get this one simple thing done. And you multiply this over and over again. So what it sounds like you're saying is this is a new realization for people who've never had to think about how the other lives, and now they're there. One of the best examples is education. If you thought you were in a good school district and you were going to send your kid to the best possible school, and then nope, no more school year, you're learning on Zoom just like everyone else, all of a sudden it feels a lot different.
You know, our daughter has 2 college educated parents. We're very involved. We're very committed to her education. And nothing has been more humbling, John, than realizing I can't really be a good homeschool teacher. And I think for a lot of people who thought all I need to do is get my kid into the right school, they're understanding, one, how difficult it is to be a teacher. They're seeing how difficult it is to manage competing demands on your time at the same time. So it doesn't really matter if you have a business Zoom call that you need to take, if your kid needs to be fed and they need help with the math homework that you didn't really understand when you did it 20 years ago, and now you have to face it again. It's also a humbling experience to realize how many families could not navigate the technical side of trying to connect to their school. And so even as people talked about, oh, we need to get Chromebooks, we need to get all of that, it was having equipment is nice, but if there's not the appropriate connection, it's just there. And I think that as we prepare for the next pandemic or the next disruption, however that comes, whenever it comes, it is my profound hope that we don't try to go back to normal. That when we think about reopening schools, we look at how many of our schools were not working. And just as we do after a hurricane, right? Hurricane Katrina hits, you don't rebuild your home the exact same way that it was before the storm. You fortify it, you build it stronger. You now know what to look for so that you can weather the next storm. And that's what I hope this sort of humbling experience of having to navigate a confusing bureaucracy that doesn't always work makes people say, this is time to do something different.
So for all the years you and I have been talking, I mean, sometimes you're the skeptic and sometimes I'm the skeptic. I mean, the skeptic in me says the American way is to rebuild it exactly the way it was. Hurricane knocks it down, I'm building that house again. Twin Towers gets knocked down, we're going to build one building, but it's going to be taller than the other buildings. Yeah. It's sort of something about the way that we think about ourselves that says we're going to get back to normal. Mm-hmm. And you're saying that maybe it's better if we don't. I mean, I would agree with that. I think a lot of people would say we can't get back to the same normal. But do you think it's realistic to think that we're going to change all that much?
I think we have changed in ways that we never thought possible already. Some people question it, but it's not as bizarre for me now to drive down the street and see many people in masks. And that was a change that happened relatively quickly. And the fact that people are now aware, so that they think about, if in fact I have to think about hygiene and sanitation in a different way, then that affects where I want to go eat. It affects what I want to do at a playground. So those incremental changes, I think, can have these bigger kinds of questions. We have spent so much of our last 10 years pushing entrepreneurship, right? Become self-sufficient, make your own, do for yourself. And we haven't fully addressed how vulnerable entrepreneurs are. And in particular, entrepreneurs from certain areas and from certain backgrounds. We're looking at a time where 40% of Black-owned businesses may not reopen once we get through this phase. I never talk about being post-COVID. Once we get through this phase of COVID, what are the long-term implications of that? What are the implications of people not being able to pay their mortgage? Should we prepare for large-scale foreclosures? And if so, how will that dramatically change the makeup of our cities, our towns, our communities, our schools? Who businesses can hire so that a state can thrive? Those are the things that we have to think about recovery and rebuilding in a different way.
And I think to loop it back to our conversation starter about identity, the reality that it's harder for Black entrepreneurs to start a business in the first place, and that they will be hit harder by this recession that comes from the pandemic, that's very clear. But then there's also the clear and very sad reality that from a health standpoint taken by itself, Black and brown people in America are getting hit by COVID a hell of a lot harder. And that's just another reality that, again, we didn't think we'd necessarily have to be talking about at the beginning of 2020, but it is forcing us to think about the fact that a whole lot of people are getting hit a lot harder by this pandemic than others are.
And the question that I always raise, John, is why? And let me give you an example of how that question of why has affected us personally. My family and I are part of this church in New Haven. And every Sunday when we would go to church, we would see this gentleman who would always sort of tilt his head and say hello to us. And I saw this story in the Connecticut Mirror about the death of this man in New Haven who had gone to the ER, who was high risk, vulnerable, gone to the ER to get help and was denied a COVID test and sent home and told to go to his doctor the next day. That man died overnight. And I thought about, here is a person who did everything that we keep telling people to do. Listen to your body, look for the signs, seek help when you get it, and was still denied care. And for his mother, for his children, for people who love them, how will that trauma stick with them when you do all the things that you're supposed to do to stay healthy and to stay well, and still someone sees you and does not validate your experience and does not listen to you? That, to me, is the legacy of COVID-19 that we have to talk about. What will it mean for these families who have lost loved ones? How do you recover from that? How do you recover when you know it could have been prevented? Not just because of your individual decision-making, but because of institutions that routinely deny you access or do not value who you are. We think about American Indians and how Indian communities have been decimated by COVID-19, but they've also been decimated by years of neglect and oversight, that when they have tried to assert their self-definition, that has been overlooked. Whether we're talking about police violence, we're talking about access to clean water, or we're talking about now COVID-19. And again, that's not about blaming a person. It is about looking structurally, how do we collectively change that so that all of us can be able to pursue our best selves?
The inability to change, though, for all the things that we're talking about, is often rooted in this, again, also a very American notion that we basically do things the right way. I mean, no matter how untrue it is, people will go on television programs every single night and say America has the best healthcare system in the world. And for some people it is. Yeah. And for a lot of people it's not. Just like people will say the police system that we have is the best in the world, or it's exactly what we need. It obviously doesn't work for some people, but it works a lot of the time for a lot of people. Those are the sort of systemic shifts, though, that I worry about, Khalilah, being able to get any traction on. Like the reality is we've been saying for such a long time that this is the healthcare system we need. This is the way we have to pay for it. This is the type of police safety we need. This is the way we have to pay for it. Those things don't just get upended overnight.
You know, one of the things that I think is so important when we talk about systems and structures are the norms that get built into those structures. And, you know, to me, institutions persist for a reason, so that you can shuffle around the players who are in that structure. You can change a couple of figureheads at an institution or within a systemic structure. But if there's not a fundamental shift in the value, the mission, and the core purpose of that structure, then you're always going to get these kinds of outcomes. So that people point to a few good examples without understanding how those few negative examples undermine the basis of all of that. I talk in the book about American exceptionalism, right? Tocqueville talked about this idea that Americans have a profound pride in their nation and are constantly thinking about their nation vis-a-vis other countries and other sort of government structures. And so I firmly believe that if people are wedded to patriotism and American exceptionalism, that is a great thing, right? James Baldwin said, "I love America more than any other country in the world. And precisely for that reason, I will criticize her perpetually." So if we want to maintain that status and that commitment to being the best country in the world, then when we see structures and events happening that undermine that status, we have to work to resolve that. You can't talk about trying to create democracy in other parts of the world when you have seeded it here at home. When in this country, we still do not have an affirmative constitutional right to vote. That is something that we all should be mobilizing around, not based on partisanship or ideology, but on that basic notion of patriotism.
There's so many things I want to talk to you about this. We only have so little time. And by the way, you can put comments in the live comments section there, and we'll hopefully get to some of them along the way. Since you talked about voting, look, of all the things in the last couple of weeks that I saw that were distressing, and there's a lot of things that are distressing, is the people in Georgia lining up for hours and hours and hours and hours to vote. The idea that that's somehow okay, that you have to give up like your whole day to go cast a vote, which is the thing that we fought for in the first place, is just ludicrous. And for the life of me, Khalilah, I've been talking to secretaries of state in Connecticut. I've been talking to lawmakers for years. Why can't we just make it easier? And there's always some reason why. Is now the time at which we finally get over that hump and say, we have to make this easier for people to do? Because if we don't, we are essentially saying we're not a democracy anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me take you back a couple of months to the pictures that came out of Wisconsin of during a global pandemic in a state that had seen a tremendous increase in the number of cases and fatalities. There are people waiting in line for hours with snow swirling around them in masks to vote. I can think of no greater form of dedication and commitment than to say, I am willing to risk my health and safety to cast this ballot. But John, it shouldn't have to be that way. People should not have to go to those lengths in order to cast a ballot. That is what is enshrined in our country's history. That is what we say makes us better than other countries, that we settle our political differences at the ballot box. And so what I think we also have to, again, I keep asking, ask the why. I tell my students, question everything. What is the incentive to keep these rules in place to make it so difficult for people to vote? You know, I think it's nice that corporations and cities and states are saying, let's make Juneteenth a holiday. I don't want you to demean the importance of that event by making it a 3-day weekend. What I'd like you to do is to make Election Day a national holiday, so that then people can use that day and not have to worry about, do I leave this line because I can't risk coming back to work late? Or do I stay here and threaten my family's economic security so that I can cast a ballot?
I mean, the thing that I think is interesting about that conversation in this time right now is less than a month into the pandemic, like restaurants had figured out a way to take my order on my phone and call me when I can go pick it up. I mean, like I could get a little buzzer that says when I can go down and vote if you're not going to give me an absentee ballot that I can just put in the mail. There's so many ways to solve this particular problem, and there's this lack of imagination about it, all rooted in the idea that we're just not that invested in giving people the franchise that they deserve.
Yeah, Sid Verba was a scholar at Harvard, and Verba wrote this piece called "Would the Dream of Political Equality Turn Out to Be a Nightmare?" And I assign that article for every class that I teach, because I want people to understand what are the incentives and disincentives for political participation in this country. You know, John, I've been seeing this meme circulating around social media that I hate. And it says, you know, we wait in line at Walmart and Target and at sporting events, we can wait in line to vote. No, that should not be the standard that we use. If in fact you say that the highest act of citizenship is to vote, to be engaged, and to care about what's happening in your community, why do we have these barriers? Why do we not have no-fault absentee voting? Why do we not have automatic registration so you have to opt out instead of having to opt in? And the same way that we recognize our brave men and women in the military serving overseas should not be refused their ability to vote, then we need to have that same level of understanding during this pandemic and once we come out of it, especially in a year where the US Census will determine, the outcome of this census will determine our funding for every aspect of our lives in this country.
Elsie in the comments just reminds us that she says the first step is to make absentee voting easier. It's incredibly difficult nationally, but incredibly difficult in Connecticut. It's one of the few states left where you need an excuse to do absentee ballot. I assume that that's something that's going to get tackled at the legislature. Okay, I want to move on to another COVID-related thing, and we'll get back to elections in just a second. You know, when we started talking in February, one of the things that was interesting to me, I didn't expect that there was going to be an identity culture war over whether or not you wore a mask. So that's one thing that we can talk about. But the other thing is this notion that's in the title of our talk, which is who is essential. I think a lot of people whose jobs had to temporarily end, maybe their businesses closed down, they didn't want them to. They said, I'm essential too. But why is it just the grocery store worker? Why is it just the healthcare worker? I mean, my job's very important as well. And I think that really spoke to this idea of identity, this identity about our work and how important it is for me to feel as though I'm essential, not just to my family, but to society.
I think it says something about our society and our culture that we are defined by the title, the occupation, and the position. And I think that discomfort that many people felt of, why are you saying that I'm not essential because I don't do one of these quote unquote frontline jobs? It also links to how we treat people that we have deemed as essential. So it's wonderful to say that our healthcare workers are essential because they are making sacrifices that many of us never could imagine, of parents staying away from their children because they don't want their children to be exposed. So they're staying with friends or staying in a college dormitory so that they can continue to take care of people. But John, if we're going to label people as essential and non-essential, then we also have to understand our obligation to treat them as such. It means something that home health aides get lost in the conversation about essential healthcare workers. When you have home health aides, predominantly women of color, many of them immigrant women of color, who get paid very low wages and are risking their lives every day to do it, of having to rely on public transportation to go care for our elders at the most vulnerable stage of their life, to think about, how do I keep doing this job that you've deemed that is essential, but you're not giving me hazard pay? I have to provide my own PPE. Oh, and wait, my kids are at home because they're not in school, but I have to continue this function. And that kind of wealth inequality, that status differential, comes into when we're talking about essential workers. It plays in when we talk about our democracy, the fact that, yes, I can go cast a ballot, but if you from your home can write one check and get the ear of a legislator who will listen to you before me, those kinds of status differences are so important and are only being magnified by this. There's nothing that we are seeing today with COVID disparities, disparities in police violence, disparities in access to voting, that is not the product of decades of indifference or active movement to try to have those barriers in place.
And the things that we are thinking about doing, or that we're in the process of changing, seem like such tiny little baby steps. The home health aide, who was making close to minimum wage a couple of years ago, was maybe making $10 an hour. And now we are saying, hooray, we've patted ourselves in the back at the state legislature. She might be making $12 or $15 an hour now. And that's going to solve the problem. That status differential is the whole thing. It's not about whether or not you have a couple hundred extra bucks than you had before to pay the crushing bills that you have and pay for the unaffordable apartment that you might live in. But it's that you're never going to be able to get to the status level that allows you to write the check, to get the access, to really get the sort of change that means something to your family.
And when that kind of difference becomes baked into the system, then we have to start addressing why it is not just difficult, John, but seemingly impossible for many people to ever get ahead. You know, and you hear this whenever there are talks about raising the minimum wage, and someone will say, well, why should a fast food worker make more than I do when I work so hard? And I take a step back and say, you know, well, do you understand who's working in the fast food industry? Do you understand that that is primarily single mothers who need an opportunity to provide for their children, to have access to healthcare so that they can do the things that they need to do? We hear that when people talk about residential mobility. And now that cities have become popular and trendy, and people now want to move back into cities from the suburbs that they fled to a decade ago, now we're seeing that kind of tension that happens when suddenly, because you've moved back into a city, now you think that you have the right to demand certain levels of service from the school system that you were indifferent to before. And I think that, again, is a moment for all of us, regardless of your social status, regardless of, you know, how many degrees you adorn yourself with, to take a step back and see just how difficult it is to, you know, break the American caste system so that you can pursue the American dream, however you define it. Home ownership is not the way today that it was 20, 30 years ago that many people imagine.
Oh, absolutely not. Right. And we learned that a decade or so ago. And I think that we're learning that once again. That idea, though, of where you can afford to live. It's been the series of an extraordinary series of articles by Jacqueline Rabe Thomas of the Connecticut Mirror, taking a look at the unaffordability of housing, but also housing segregation across Connecticut, one of the most segregated states in the entire country. And I know that you've seen some of these, Khalilah, over the course of the last week or so. The Mirror has been tweeting out statistics town by town of some of the most segregated towns. And these are places where, in fairly large numbers, very well-meaning white residents have been coming out and holding protest signs, and they've been holding Black Lives Matter rallies, and they care about some of the very things that we're talking about. And the reality is that the voting patterns in those towns have essentially allowed for the type of development that would never allow Black people to live there under almost any circumstances.
Mhm.
I don't know if that is something that you feel might begin to change or shake in people's minds, but it certainly is something that I think people are taking some notice of.
John, I think that we all have to be willing to be uncomfortable, and we have to be willing to be wrong. And so while it is wonderful that people are protesting and they are opposing what's happening over there, wherever over there is, when you come back home, turn your lens back home. It is not by happenstance that the demographics of your child's school is what it is. It is not by happenstance that when you look up and down your block, that who is living in your neighborhood looks how they do. And it's not to say that that is in and of itself a bad thing, right? Like I'm way past people feeling guilty. Tell me what you're going to do. So instead of telling me that you're an ally, instead of wearing a safety pin to show me that you're an ally, I mean, I have received more emails, John, in the last 2 weeks than I think I collectively have in my entire life. Instead of telling me that, show me. Show me that by going to the Board of Zoning meeting. Show me that by going to your Board of Education meetings and asking, what are your district's plans to actively recruit a more diverse teaching staff, right? Tell me what you are going to do to pressure your governor or pressure your first selectman to take these issues seriously so that when the Black classmate of your child comes to visit you, they aren't tracked from the time they enter the town limits until the point that they leave. And that, I think, is something that, whether you're from a small town or from a suburb or you live in the city, that we need to think about these things collectively. You know, I'm seeing in some of the comments questions about, well, why did we see people waiting in line in Georgia? Or why are we seeing these things in Wisconsin? All of that is structural. So just as we see it in our towns, it's all structural. And it's things that happen over a long period of time. So if I could just give one quick point to that, right? I study, I'm a political scientist. I study voting rights. That is, my sort of passion of studying voting rights. And in 2015, my family and I went to Selma, Alabama, because I had written this national report about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I was surprised by how many people did not realize that the United States Supreme Court had gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So that over these last few years, we have seen the closing of voting booths and precincts. We have seen, and we all know, government doesn't really work that fast. But within hours of that Shelby v. Holder decision, we saw the adoption of new laws that made it harder to vote. We are seeing some of those same things when it comes to access to housing, when it comes to access to jobs. So that in 2020, we were surprised that the Supreme Court said you should not be able to discriminate against people based on their gender identity. And young people say, why did we need a Supreme Court decision to get that? And the rest of us are saying, who knew Gorsuch would have written that opinion in that way? So it shows us how all of these things connect back to identity. But it also, to me, is why when Facebook prophets say that your vote does not matter, we have so many examples of why it does at your local level and at the federal and state level.
So let's for a second talk about the leaders that we may get, because so much of that has to do with identity. So Joe Biden, who is sort of, I think, through this series of weird primaries and I guess attrition, has become the nominee for the Democratic Party. And he's running against Donald Trump. And he says, I'm going to pick a woman to be my vice presidential candidate. And he does this before the killing of George Floyd and before these protests are up around America and before Black Lives Matter has become a chant that is on the lips of so many Americans, not just Democrats, who are going to vote coming up in November. So what does this mean for Joe Biden? And how do you think about this particular choice that he's framed for himself? Basically saying, well, just so you know, I'm going to pick a woman. And now I know that there's a debate within the Democratic Party. Well, are we going to get Elizabeth Warren? Or are we going to get one of the Black women that he can choose from? Because you know that that's part of the conversation that's happening in Democratic circles.
Of course. And again, some people were very upset that Joe Biden said, my running mate will be a woman. And yet we've had hundreds of years of American politics where people have explicitly said, I'm a man and my running mate will be a man. And we didn't think anything about that.
They didn't even have to say that. They just assumed.
It's assumed, right? Because that's the way that it has always been. And we're comfortable with the status quo in many ways. What I think is so important for Joe Biden or for any political candidate, right? We're going to come into some big state races over the next couple of years as well. What I want people to understand is that it's not about saying, I want this person just because they are a woman. When we know that when you are not a part of the majority, however that is defined, you have to be 3 times as good as the person who can be mediocre simply because they represent how things have always been done. And so when I look at the women that Joe Biden has to choose from, they're quite accomplished, right? They all have political experience. They all have been to navigate and be successful in multiple areas and arenas of their life. They didn't wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm bored. I think I want to be on a presidential administration because I have nothing else to do. And so I think that's then for us to say, all things being equal, why haven't we had this yet? And I think for Joe Biden, it's going to be a tough decision for him. And I think the person that he thought maybe could be a VP in March, now with all of the unrest in this country, that calculation shifts. And it's also why I think people cannot take for granted the importance of the November elections, not just at the presidential level, right? I'm all for local politics, but there are important races at every level, not just for president. Because whoever becomes president or stays president will have the opportunity to appoint people to the United States Supreme Court who will serve for a lifetime and whose decisions will affect each and every one of us, regardless of how stable we think we are, regardless of how privileged and connected we are, whether you're talking about gun rights or reproductive rights or education, the stakes are incredibly high.
So talk a little bit more, though, if you will, about the reality of identity politics in America right now, and the fact that many people in the Democratic Party, in the traditional Democratic Party, will say, reject this idea of identity politics being the lens through which we should look, right? We should be looking for the best candidate. The candidate is going to help us beat Donald Trump, and it doesn't matter if they're a Black woman or not. What do you say? What do you say to them?
So I say I agree. I think you should pick the best person for that job. I think whether it is your team and your staff, it is your cabinet, it is your running mate, it is your candidate. The best person for that job should be selected. And what I also think we have to honor and recognize, John, is that too often people claim it's a pipeline problem. We're America. We create the pipelines that we want. If there aren't people in the pipeline, then you create the pipeline, you fund it, you invest it, you commit to it. And that is whether we are talking about the dearth of women of color who tend to ascend to those higher positions, or we are talking about the fact that now we need to broaden our language and our understanding. When you have people who have been, a transgender official elected in West Virginia, that's something I never expected in my lifetime. But what it also means is that if you have a Tammy Duckworth being elected to the Senate out of Illinois, maybe you need to think about how women who are mothering may have a different set of demands on their time that does not take away from the job that they do. And so I think that Democrats need to get a backbone, and this isn't partisan, I say this about anyone, need to get a backbone and don't run away from identity, right? Identity is what worked in 2016 to get Donald Trump elected. Identity is what is working in 2020 when people talk about who is essential and whose lives matter, whose experience should dominate. If I decide I want to go have a drink with my friends outside, who are you to tell me that I can't do that? So identity is at the root of everything that happens in this country politically, in our personal lives, and in our democracy. Let's embrace that and acknowledge it and not try to run away from it.
Mm. You talked earlier about feeling uncomfortable and people needing to feel uncomfortable in this time. I know that it's something that you've heard a lot from white colleagues, from white friends, people reaching out saying, how can I help you? And you've talked a little bit about that, about the action that you're looking for, not necessarily the words. One thing I was thinking about as you were talking before, though, was the notion that what you're requiring people to really do here is not just be uncomfortable, but it's to give up something of themselves. Mm-hmm. It's to say that I have so much, in part because of the system that we're in. And for me to help moving forward, it requires me to give up something that I've held close. That's a hard thing for people to do, but it feels to me like that's really the ask here.
It is a hard thing for people to do. It is something that for many people goes against their human nature, right? Like we are taught, we are conditioned, we are socialized to gain what we can and then protect it and hold it for ourselves. But what I know, John, is that I come out of a legacy and a family where that was not the value. My grandfather was this amazing influence in my life, this man who had a 6th grade education, who gave up his education to help his family, but also worked so hard his entire life so that, my siblings and I never had to think about doing that. It meant that when he got that good factory job, he wasn't content being the only one because he knew that was a hollow prize. And instead, he used his access and his position to create opportunities for other young men in the community. And now we all get to reap the benefits of seeing generations of Black men in my tiny hometown who, but for my grandfather saying, once you get through the door, you have an obligation to hold it open for others, now could take care of their families, could send their kids to school, could now take a vacation with their grandchildren. And that's what I want people to do. I want people to do what I have done, what I have seen other people do, what I have seen community folks do every day. And is to realize if the room does not look like this country, ask why and change it. And that is whatever room you find yourself in.
And this idea of an obligation to hold the door open for others, it sounds like that's something that's at the key. It's a key to one of the things that we're dealing with right now, is that there's a battle in American identity over people who say, I deserve to live exactly the way that I've always lived and that I want to live. And people who say, I really think that the way I live is dependent on all the others around me and what I can do with them to help them. As you've explored identity throughout your career in politics, as we close out, how have you seen that divide? Because it really is, to me, the most important one in America right now. It's people who are selfish, frankly, and think about themselves, and people who think about others. That's it. I mean, I don't know that it's all that much different than that. And that's about empathy, and it's about a lot of other things. But that's also a piece of identity.
It is a big piece of identity because for many people, their self-identity is based on some hierarchy that they have imagined or benefited from or actively created. And the way that I see it in terms of how I navigate my own work and how I set the path and walk into the path that has been created for me is that I think about however we get to the destination that we want to achieve, people are going to come for different motivations. Mm-hmm. I work in the world of philanthropy now. And some people give because they want to make the community better and they want to make the community stronger. And some people give because they want to be able to take that deduction at the end of the year. My role is not to define for you why you should give or why you should contribute or why you should think beyond yourself. My role is to figure out, how do we put people, not a person, but people in place in multiple spaces to be able to navigate that and channel that for good. So if all you want to think about is your own selfish interest, that's fine. But think about, if we don't figure out how to address education as a civil right, it means that that wonderful company that you've built won't really have a strong workforce to choose from 10 years from now because we haven't invested in creating it on the front end. When you decide that you want to sell your home, if we haven't looked at housing inequality in this country, where are you going to go? If we haven't figured out how to protect the vote, the most basic piece of American democracy, then we can't really be upset when we get the government that we have not protected. And so that's where I want people to think. It's not about guilt. It's not about feeling like you have to apologize. And I've been saying that to people for 2 weeks. Please stop apologizing to me for who you are. Your tears will not help me. But instead, tell me how you will channel those tears into action, whether it's major action or small, because I do believe that those small, everyday, incremental changes can work. That's how we get there, realizing everyone doesn't have to get to the table for the same reason, but we have to be there.
Are you basically hopeful about our democracy?
I am more hopeful now, John, than I have been in a very long time. And that says something for me as a lifelong skeptic.
I'm glad to hear that.
So am I. I'm really glad to hear that, right? I am hopeful, again, because of the energy and passion of young people who refuse to be content and complacent, and who are pushing all of us, including me, who are pushing us beyond our comfort level to understand degrees won't save us, the proper zip code won't protect us, and that if we don't commit to that for all people, then the value of the life we think we have created means little.
Khalilah, it's always good to talk to you. And this was a lot of fun. I will tell you a couple things here real quick. Again, the book is on her shelf behind her there, but it's Identity Politics in the United States, Dr. Khalilah Brown-Dean. And you're part of a wonderful institution, Quinnipiac University, which I was a part of for a number of years, got a graduate degree there. We were both part of a really incredible event tonight with the International Festival of Arts and Ideas. And I always say this, that the International Festival of Arts and Ideas is something that is unique in not just New Haven, but in America. Not a whole lot of places have ideas events like this. And so don't take it for granted. So thank you so much for joining us. And my friend, very good to see you. Hope to see you in person again soon.
Yes, be well, my friend. Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Elizabeth?
Oh, hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I was sitting here, I just writing down quotes after quote. I so appreciate you all spending the time with us. I want to say a few things. One, we want to know what you think still. If you go to artidea.org/survey, please let us know what you're thinking. And then we have ideas events coming up every single day this week about things that y'all talked about tonight. So tomorrow, we're going to talk about the importance of the census as it relates to the U.S. Constitution in our Constitution Cafe at 5 p.m. It's on Zoom, so you got to register beforehand. Everyone is welcome to join. On Thursday, we're talking about voter rights in a workshop with a whole coalition of people in New Haven talking about voting rights. So please sign up for that as well. And then Friday, we're talking about slavery and the American story with Pulitzer Prize winner Nicole Hannah-Jones, Al Lutzen, Mercy Quay, and a new song by Paul Brian Hudson. So it's a big event, a big week for events and lots of ideas. And I hope to see you all there soon. Have a great night, everybody.